That worked.
Seems so.
Yeah,
It's
success.
gorgeous, so.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. This is the Cultural Studies podcast. Toby Miller is either absent or late because he had something he had to attend to. But we are here to talk about a book called Film as World Literature that was published at the end of last year by Bloomsbury. There it is. Um, and it's a collection of 17 chapters from different parts of the world and different moments in film history. I was editing the book. I became aware that Bloomsbury was moving this series towards a broader idea of literature that would combine with other types of media, even while they're continuing with the literary content of their world literature series. So I was interested in developing that idea. I was working on another book called Cinema and the Political Imagination that was published by Bloomsbury, and being a tiny bit out of field in film studies, I thought editing the book would also give me the background for working on that other book. But that book was about third cinema and its legacies in contemporary cinema. Um, and so I guess we'll start by going around the room and everyone can introduce themselves while I cough. So my name is Robin Goodman. I'm a distinguished research professor of English at Florida State University. I teach film and a lot of critical theory and feminist theory. Zahi?
Yeah, my name is Zahi Zalloua. I teach in indigeneity, race, and ethnicity studies at Whitman College. Teach courses on the Palestinian question, critical Black studies, and the post-human.
Evren?
I'm Evren Ozselcuk. I am teaching at the University of South Carolina in English and also in the film and media program. I am currently working on a project on border narratives and border aesthetics, but generally my area is transnational cultural studies, global cinema, um, cinemas of the Middle East, especially Turkish cinema and television. Yeah.
So Zahi and I are actually on our way to the University of South
I
Carolina.
know. I just saw that yesterday. I was going to bring that up. And it's the same time as SCMS. So I'm going to be in Chicago at the
Oh,
Oh,
yes. So, but that may be on the 26th. I think I'm leaving on the 27th. But if you're arriving on the 26th, I would love to see you. I mean, while you're
that'd
here.
be fun.
Or
Yeah.
maybe catch up on the 29th sometime. I mean, what we should talk about it later. Yeah.
Vlad?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Vlad Dima. I'm a professor of African American Studies at Syracuse University. My background is really in French studies. My PhD was in French, but it would take too long to explain how I ended up here. I teach mostly African cinemas and African fiction, but my books also deal with sound studies in Global South, representation of soccer in African cinemas, meaning of image, and my most recent book is on Black Girl by Wisman Semben, 1966. So it's nice to meet you all, and I'm excited to be here.
All right, Richard?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Richard Baxstrom. I'm professor of anthropology and the humanities at the University of Edinburgh. And although I'm based in Scotland, you can probably hear the American accent. So I am originally from the United States and I emigrated over almost 20 years ago now. So I am located in the social anthropology, the Department of Social Anthropology here, but that gives me quite a lot of latitude to engage with other sorts of things. So, in addition to teaching in the School of Social and Political Science, I also teach at the Edinburgh College of Art, which is part of the university, and have been able to sort of, have some interdisciplinarity within the things that I teach and the things that I write about. So everything from urban, political, and economic anthropology to a couple of books that I've co-authored with a good friend and colleague, Todd Myers from McGill, on cinema, one about the film Hexen, and one about kind of nonfiction slash vaguely anthropological, but also avant-garde films from people like Lucien Castillon-Taylor or Joshua Oppenheimer, people like that. So engaging with creative arts, with cinema, and perhaps in the future with literature in a more explicit way is something that I've been able to integrate into a more traditional kind of ethnographically oriented anthropological engagement with life and the world and my students and whatnot. So so if you look at my CV, it doesn't make sense, but that's kind of also what makes it interesting. So I'm glad to be here and good to meet you all.
That last book was how I was introduced to your work, and it made
Oh,
me
right.
into a vegan for a few minutes, or maybe a few days. Um,
Oh,
the part about the fish was devastating.
yeah. I don't know if you've seen Leviathan, but I actually, the film, it's so carefully designed. Lucien Castillon-Taylor's Leviathan. There's also the Russian Leviathan, which is a different film, but I actually felt physically nauseous in the theater, not because of what I was seeing, but because of the sound design. Like they had turned it up, and it was an extraordinarily overwhelming sensory experience, I have to say. Like just really aggressive and intended to be so. But yeah, it hasn't quite made me a vegan, but it did make me sick.
Okay, so maybe we can go around and everyone can reflect on their chapters a little bit from the book Film as World Literature. I wrote the introduction, and I'm basically asking a question about media and genre, about how whether there's because we have these different disciplines of cinema studies and literary studies, and they're separate, whether that's leaving out some kinds of fruitful questions that we could pursue, and particularly in terms of the political, if that separation has hidden some kind of political realities. And I just want to raise those questions in the introduction. And then in my chapter, I speak about the film All That Breathes, which is a film from India about people who were reading Muscle Flex magazine and learned how to repair injured birds that were falling out of the sky. So I was basically comparing that to a book from Australia called Migrations, where the birds are also falling out of the sky, and asking the question of the outside, like how within theory you can start to imagine a subjectivity that isn't bound to the inside of capitalism. So that's where I was going with that chapter. Zahi, do you want to talk about yours?
Sure. So, my chapter focuses on Eli Solomon's divine intervention. I teach this film in my Palestine course. The long title of the Palestine course is Continental Philosophy, Postcolonial Theory, and the Palestinian Question. And this film usually does a lot of kind of labor in the course. We do the heavy theory of thinking Palestine in the context of the Jewish question and so forth. But the film is able to kind of intervene and illustrate, the image of Palestine, the image of Palestinian identity. So if there's a lot of effort among Palestinian scholars like Said to put forward this imperative of the permission to narrate, to tell the Palestinian story, to present a kind of counter identity, counter narrative to the dominant Zionist framework that reduces Palestinians to pure evil, like, bloodthirsty terrorists, or a newer category that is emerging as the abject victim. So you have these two dominant images of Palestinians, right? In the past, they were invisible. Nobody would talk about Palestinians. Now you have certain representations of Palestinians, but they're very limiting. Either pure victim or pure evil. So the film intervenes at that level. And Jacques Rancière had commented on Solomon's film, and he gestured through this idea of the luxury of playing with words and images. And that luxury has been denied to Palestinians. So the film plays with ideas. It brings in comedy to talk about the occupation without minimizing the horrors of the occupation, but it gives you a different insight in Palestinian identity, Palestinian representation, and most importantly, Palestinian resistance. So that's what I like the film. The film does all this labor. It harnesses ressentiment, a concept that is kind of dear to me because it has the negative dimension, the Nietzschean critique of ressentiment, but also points to an alternative ressentiment of the oppressed that can be harnessed as a means of critique.
So I know Suleiman has said that he doesn't want to talk about Palestinians and national identity. He doesn't want to talk about identity, and there's a kind of cosmopolitan sense to his comedy.
Sure.
But you want to read it as a
No,
identity?
I definitely not. No, I don't want to read it as identitarian, but you're playing with images of Palestinians. So anytime you play with images of Palestinians, absolutely, I think, in the same way that Said is, he wants to bring the exilic as a defining feature of what it means to be Palestinian. I think Solomon adopts a similar orientation. It's not an identitarian account of Palestinian identity. It resists, it undoes certain images of Palestinians that gets imposed on them. And along the way, you're fashioning a different kind of Palestinian. You're looking at the Palestinians in their everydayness, how they interact, how they laugh, there's humor. And it's hard to imagine Palestinians as subjects who laugh, right? Rabelais once said, le rire, c'est le propre de l'homme. Laughter is what defines the human. And precisely laughter has been neglected, denied to Palestinians. So the film brings that into being.
So in that first film in that trilogy, the Suleiman trilogy, it ends with the Israeli national anthem. I know that's been controversial. Do you have a take on that?
I don't. What I like about divine intervention, especially, is the beginning of the film that throws you into kind of unsettling feeling, right? You have a bunch of children chasing Santa Claus and stabbing Santa Claus, right? So you begin with a kind of disorientation. What are the conditions that provoked these students to go after Santa Claus? Is an attempt to make sense, but the film precisely refuses to make sense in a very kind of programmatic, didactic fashion. But it's a nice entry into Palestinian life. What are the conditions that create this hatred for a figure that promises gifts?
Yeah, and Santa Claus is terrified and running away.
Yeah, he doesn't die, he's stabbed, but we later discover him in the hospital. So
yeah. Evren, do you want to talk about your chapter?
Sure, yeah. So I wrote on a film by the Iranian-Danish filmmaker Ali Abbasi. The film is called Border, and it's an adaptation from a short story that was written by a Swedish author, John Ajvide Linksvit. You might have heard of him because an earlier book of his was adapted to cinema, Let the Right One In, which kind of created a real splash. And it was actually adapted twice, once in, I think, Swedish cinema, and then there's an American version of it too. So when Border came out in 2018, I think it was Abbasi's first film, if I'm not mistaken. And that also created quite a splash in sort of global sort of film circles, in sort of these international film festivals. It got a number of awards for its like innovative sort of non-traditional filmmaking. So that was the first sort of, and it's I don't know if anybody's seen it, but it is a very, very unusual film. I mean, it is, yeah. So, but then, you know, I was thinking how the film, how Abbasi adapted the short story to film in a way that really, um, um, on the one hand, it's, you know, he really took seriously the tactile language of the short story, and really translated that tactile language onto the cinema screen in this sort of haptic visual aesthetic, what that emphasizes the sense of touch. I mean, of course, haptic visuality, I'm drawing from Laura Marx. So that emphasizes the sense of touch, but it also brings to the fore the multi-sensory sort of aspects of film viewing. So, and I was also thinking how in that adaptation, he was also able to imagine a radically different way of relating to the world, by really showing, okay, what it would be like if we were relating to the world like this main character, Tina, who's a mythical creature. She's a troll, but she doesn't know it, or at least up until to some, you know, point in the story, she doesn't know that she's a troll. But she navigates the world through like she has a very different kind of sensorium, right? I mean, and she navigates the world through her sense of smell and touch mostly, and she works as a border agent. So she works as a border agent because the border regime actually exploits her, right? Because her sense of smell is so good, she can sniff out smugglers, criminals, because she can smell, you know, shame or guilt or like anxiety. So anyways, but like how Abbasi was able to show us, like, okay, what would it mean to navigate this world, right? Not through the noble sense of the sight, which is, you know, the sight that became really dominant, right, after like Enlightenment, and how these other more proximate senses of smell and touch were then denigrated and repudiated, you know, under modernity. So he's basically saying, okay, or rather the film is showing what would it be like if we, you know, experience the world, if we prioritize these other senses. So that was, and more so than the short story, I argue that it is able to imagine this alternative way of relating to otherness, precisely because it is able to sort of, you know, imagine relating to the world through our proximate senses. So, I mean, and then, you know, I talk about like the concept of the creaturely as sort of, not because, you know, Tina is just a fantastic creature, but she is kind of the embodiment of those aspects of the human that are creaturely, that are therefore, you know, sort of pushed aside and, as I was saying, repudiated. So she becomes kind of an embodiment of all of that. And through the creaturely, you know, the film imagines this alternative way of relating to the world. So that's the basic sort of shape and the argument of the chapter.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about the idea of touch and cinema? Because most people are thinking about cinema as visual.
Right. So yeah, I mean, it is really, I mean, through certain medium specific capabilities, film is also able to communicate like these other sensory experiences, like for instance, close-ups or out of focus images, or a play of light, like either too much exposure, too little exposure, the play of foreground, background, I think cinematography or cinematographical aspects are the ways in which that other senses of images can become visible or palpable or, you know, feelable, whatever, in our viewing. So in Border, there are a lot of these what I say haptic scenes, where Tina, especially when she is in nature. So she is sort of making friends with foxes and trees, and so the camera follows her really closely in this creaturely way. As a film scholar has also come up with this um, um, uh, uh, creaturely cinematography. So it's different from the voyeuristic gaze of mainstream cinema. It's more convivial. It's not really sort of focusing on the face, but really focusing, or rather following the bodily rhythms, movements, the sounds, that the body is making as it's moving in the world. Um, so the film really has these scenes that bring forth the kind of the embodied experience of the main character in a haptic way. I don't know if this is making things clear, or if you want.
Oh, it is. It is.
Okay.
But I also wanted to follow up and ask you about world, because most people are going to be thinking of touch as local in comparison to vision, which would be more spatial. So do you have a sense of
Right.
how?
Yeah. There's that, of course. The thing about touch and smell is, they are proximate because they are much more. The reason why they were repudiated is because they're so bodily, right? And the body becomes this kind of abject thing almost, right? At some point. And so, yeah, in that sense, they're very local. Um, um, yeah.
Mhm.
I
Okay.
have to think about the other stuff a little bit, I think.
Uh-huh. Vlad, do you want to talk about your chapter?
Sure. As I was listening to everybody, it's so much fun to be in even though it's a virtual room, to hear sort of connections to my own work. And then I was like, yeah, of course, because we're all in the same volume. It's not like
Yeah.
them. But I was like, I'm not really used to it. I'm the only person in my department who does anything with film. So, from the beginning when Richard talked about sound and, sort of like overpowering, that's one of the things that I've worked on myself, this sort of sound touching us, which connects to what Evren just talked, right? And it was nice to hear Rancière being brought up by Zahi too. So there's all these interesting connections. I've long been interested in haptic visuality myself. There is this Cameroonian director. His name is Jean-Pierre Bekolo, and he has a knack for creating hard to decipher images, or almost impossible to decipher images. To sort of piggyback on what everyone was saying, like basically what happens in those moments, our eyes just kind of glide over the image without being able to penetrate it, right? So then the sense of like the skin of film, or the skin of cinema, like, what the Barker would call, and Laura Marx and all those people, that's when it becomes, I think, a little more obvious, right? Because it just creates this kind of sort of like border that we don't go beyond. Right. And also, of course, like film, we forget because we think through the visual. Myself in my work, I think through the sonic a lot more, and sort of like what hits us, So again, to go back to Richard's expression about being overpowered, overwhelmed by sound, that feels to me like it's a very material contact that's being made by way of the speakers. But even image, the way image falls on us, and hits us, or a retina, there is a physical impact. It's minimal, but it's there, it's not. And so we can absolutely, that's sort of like our way into discussing all these other senses in film, right? So for that was a parenthesis. I just wanted to be part of the conversation because you guys are like making me think of a lot of different things that I'm interested in. So for my chapter, From the Page to the Screen, Ousmane Sembène's Camera Kadu, I was trying to accomplish a number of things. A lot of it is connected to earlier studies of mine. I'm interested, let me bring it down to maybe three items, and then I'll sort of like fill in the gaps. So horizontality, or orality, and future, basically, or of African cinemas, that is. So like these three terms are essential for me. That's kind of the backbone of the chapter. I'm going to start at the top with this term kadu. Kadu is a Wolof word that often gets translated as word. In some cases, I've seen it translated as letter, meaning like, so Safify has a movie from 1975 called Kadu Beykat, and it gets translated as letter from my village, not word from my village. But, send a letter, send word, same thing, I guess, in a sense. And this was, one of Semben's most important projects, at least in his own perspective, was initiating the African public, or allowing his films, his stories to be told in a language other than the colonizer's language. So not in French, even though he has done films in French, or he inserts French in strategic portions, places. And Kadu is the title of a newspaper that he started in Dakar, Senegal. That was, the only one of its kind, news in one of the indigenous languages to Senegal. It's not the only language. It's probably the most popular. And the second would be Serer. So he's shot in the language of Serer as well. So I was starting to think about his transition from writer to filmmaker, and I was trying to sort of capture, what does he bring new? And this term comes on a long line of, mostly French theory, mostly French philosophy, camera stylo, right, from Astruc, cinécriture from Agnès Varda, cine poetry is my old advisor at Minnesota, Cristoforo Romana, camera magneto by Claudia Gorman, going towards sound, the sound area. And I was trying to think about what is different about Semben's approach to filmmaking, and how heavy is the literary trace, especially in his early films. We're talking Borom Saret Nyai and Black Girl, and all the way to 1975 with Hala, right? And I think it's there. I mean, most people will say, most scholars have said, these are literary works because they have, a narrative voice, like, you have voiceover, but it goes way beyond that, right? So that's the other term here, orality, that gets added. So what do I mean by horizontality? Two major threads in my work, and I use Semben for this. One is reversing the hierarchy image of image being primary and going to sound, right? Sonic, thinking things through sound first, which is not really a global north. We're not that well equipped to do that. We still think through the eye generally. So that reversal is one. But also the other one is sort of fighting against the idea that culture moves from global north to the global south, meaning, that we have this sort of hierarchy here, right? And instead of completely reversing it and saying, global south is on the top, it's this idea of horizontality that comes from Paul Gilroy, and then Achille Mbembe picks it up. And he's actually written a lot more about that than Paul Gilroy ever did. But with that, then I was starting to think, well, I'm going to talk about Semben. I'm going to talk about indigenous languages. I'm going to talk about his transition from literature to film, which is in itself is very interesting, because he's not using let's say, quote unquote influences, another word I hate, like the Francois Truffauts of the world, or Godards of the world. He is sort of drawing inspiration from himself, from his own writing, and that's a very important element here. But my horizontality sort of idea was, let's see, like, what happens if I still use some French theory, like Jacques Rancière's sentence image. What does that mean in the context of Semben? So, going beyond what is shown, or going beyond what is written, beyond the sayable, beyond the visible. So I'm adding this sort of attention to what we hear, right? To the effect that sound has on us by way of orality, whether it's griots that appear in films, proverbs, songs, voiceover too, but there's, again, a lot more that we can discuss in terms of orality. And then I look at, we can come back because I'm taking a lot of time going back to Black Girl and what that means, but and sort of its impact, because it's based off of a short story, and the person, the main character, is fictional, but it's also a real person. So there's a lot of different interesting layers here. And then I end the chapter with a gesture towards the future. I've noticed somewhat of a more positive trend in the last 10 years, both in representation, cinematic representation, but also, in what people like Felwine Sarr talk about, or again, Achille Mbembe, where there is this renewed optimism about the future of the continent. And I do think that Sembène plays a big part in that as the so-called father of African cinemas. So I was trying to look at kind of where we see some of those traces, and I found them in Druzu's film Nanny, and in Doucouré's film Mignon Cuties, and in Jordan Peele's Get Out. And so there's all these elements where the influence, this, pillar of intellectualism and cinematic representation is at the same level as European filmmakers and American filmmakers, and it is a true question of horizontality. So that's kind of in somewhat brief, but I can come back if there are questions. And
Yeah, I have a question. So to me, teaching Simbeni, he has a quite a range. So with a black girl, it's tragic, right? And it's fictional, as you said. And there's a kind of crisis of the written word in Black Girl, and then like the voiceover you talked about, but it's not really a voiceover as much as an internal dialogue that's being externalized, right? Because it
yeah.
belongs to the characters. And then in the later films, it's much more comedic, and it's more of a critique of the post-colonial state and independence, and more post-colonial and a little bit more anthropological. So could you talk about that trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. But I will say, yes, moving sort of backwards, Hala in 1974 is definitely more of a direct critique of post-colonial state. Black Girl in 1966 is a critique of the white French, and sort of their perpetual influence over Black bodies, like a literal sort of influence that they have on the body of Diwana. So it is fictional, but Diwana was a real person. Sembène. So I should say, for those of you not in this room, but whoever is going to listen. So Black Girl is basically the story of a Senegalese maid who lives in Dakar. Her name is Diwana. She's hired by two white couple to be the nanny for their children in Dakar. Then she gets invited to go to the south of France in the city of Antibes to continue this job. But once she gets there, she kind of becomes a prisoner in this apartment. She also has to cook for them. She has to clean, and she has to take care of the children. And in her own words, I am their prisoner and I am their slave. And then there's, months and months of mistreatment, racism from guests and the family. Madame is, quite terrible. So is Monsieur, actually. But anyway, she takes her own life at the very end, in sort of a moment of which is a little bit ambiguous, in a sense. Doyle Calhoun calls this sort of a resistance to the post-colonial system, but of course it's a Pyrrhic victory, if at all, because she does lose her life. And Sembène inserts an actual newspaper clipping that's real. That's not, that prop is, not made up. It's, or that describes the death of a person named Diwana Gomis. There's this scholar at Cambridge, his name is Doyle Calhoun, who wrote last year a book called The Suicide Archive. And he actually went to the south of France and uncovered the death certificate and everything. He traced down this actual person who hails from the same area as Sembène in the south of Senegal. And I suspect, this is not proven, but I suspect that Sembène really saw her as a kin, more so than, any other compatriot, because she was coming also from Casamance, from this region. The word that you referenced, Robin, is very interesting, because I just talked about this in my class. I just taught this film this week. And first of all, there's two actresses playing the part. Sam Ben supposedly didn't have money to bring Mbissine Diop to Paris to do dubbing in post-production. So he hired Toto Bissant, who's a Haitian singer. And that in itself creates a very interesting dynamic here because the voice that's very full, very melodious, kind of contrasts with what the short story and the film tell us about Diwanna's level of French. So it's quote unquote a much better French that we hear, even though it's internalized. And there's this particular moment where Diwanna supposedly receives a letter from her mom, written word, that Monsieur reads to her because Diwanna cannot read or write. And in that, the mother is like, why aren't you sending money? What's going on? And Diwanna refuses to believe that's true. And it is a little bit ambiguous. But then Monsieur starts writing a letter for Diwanna and puts words in her mouth, literally writes for her, stealing her own voice. Diwanna, by the way, parenthesis at the very end, cuts her own throat, which, removes any sort of, possibility of speaking again, right? So the interesting element there is that Sam Ben inserts himself in the film in a cameo, and he is a letter writer in Dakar. He actually, translates for people and writes letters for people. And it's quite possible that that's true, that's real, the letter that she receives, but she like, is distraught that, her family might think less of herself. So kind of lost my train of thought there, Robin. I don't know if I answered your question. I just fill in with like some
No, but
information.
everything you said was really
Yeah.
interesting.
Okay.
When I've taught Black Girl, I sometimes use the image of the painting of the death of Marat with the hand. It's also in the bathtub, and the
Yeah.
arm is, and it's a revolutionary figure who also is killed by the struggle. So students think that it's a relevant image to the
Yeah.
film. I don't know if it's a direct citation or not.
Right.
Richard, do you want to talk about your chapter?
I can do that. I mean, I was tempted. I won't go into a big parenthesis as well, but I was also Evren's comments are actually quite dear to a lot of the things that I've done in other works, particularly around the haptic qualities of cinema and ethnographic or nonfiction. We'll put that in quotes. The ability to actually convey or confront certain empirical aspects of the world in a way that the word never can. And it has that, it's because of this quality. So perhaps rather than me going into that parenthesis, maybe we can come back to that quite provocative sort of element of her chapter. So I'll just move to mine though. And I actually, film as world literature, I think I actually, rather than going through the expected sort of route of figuring out a film and then talking about it and going in that direction, I started from trying to understand I guess a certain set of novels or the writing, and then coming back to cinema. And so my chapter is actually about a group of well-known, I intentionally chose fairly famous authors who in North America at least were all published by Grove Press in the 1950s and 60s. And it met, the opportunity to contribute this chapter actually allowed me to do something I've wanted to do for a long time, which is write something about Grove Press. I worked for Grove's most famous owner and editor, Barney Rossett, for a number of years in the 1990s. And that's how I kind of came into my interest in the press as the press and its authors as part of a group that would be connected to that. And what my chapter is actually trying to illustrate, first of all, is that there are a number of authors which were all published or what I call curated, actually, it wasn't just an editorial sort of move on Barney Rossett's and his staff's part, but there's almost a kind of curatorial function in bringing together certain formally innovative and disruptive works where the formal aspects of the writing, of the novels, of the expression actually begins to blur or dissolve any sort of distinction that we might make in certain respects between cinema and between literature. So in other words, a kind of cinematic writing is what I'm trying to assert. I talk about William S. Burroughs' the Nova trilogy. I talk about Marguerite Duras' The Ravishing of Lowell Stein, which actually started out as a film treatment that was never made into a film, as far as I know, but was published as a novel. And you know, in a interesting way, I mean, Samuel Beckett's Film, which is both writing and film, and kind of neither one at the same time. I don't know if everyone is familiar with the actual film or the script, but it is a really quite challenging and interesting work, and it sits really interestingly within Beckett's overall kind of, his career as a writer and an artist. So so I basically wanted to write about those authors, but also to write about them and in the context of having been brought together not only for commercial purposes, but also a kind of a way of understanding some other aspects of why Grove as an institution that published literature, that actually released films, that actually supported a lot of different kinds of creative activity and commercial activity, actually in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, certainly in North America, like how we could perhaps make sense of this in a slightly different way than it is typically made sense of. The more typical understanding of Grove's innovation and importance has to do with, and it quite truthfully, it's not incorrect to say that, the fight that Grove waged against censorship, the publication of certain radical left and countercultural political tracts, the Evergreen Review and its role in the counterculture. All of these things I think are consistently associated with Grove's significance as a publisher at this time, and sort of Barney's orientation to how he ran the press and who he published and what he was interested in. But I would actually say, and I say this in part looping back to actually having known Barney and worked with him a little bit, is that there were other elements involved in this, and that he did have, I think, a quite distinct, if quite idiosyncratic, interest in formal innovation, and this was certainly one of them. And so it asserts a different kind of significance. And to me, perhaps, I don't want to weigh up as one being more important than the other, but certainly something that I think has quite long-lasting effects, even beyond the sort of the overtly political publications that Grove published, but the kind of the formal qualities and the kind of coherence in certain respects of many of these authors is actually a legacy that we also shouldn't ignore or downplay, and that it actually has a bearing on our film as world literature, kind of broadly speaking, the kind of the topic and what coheres in the volume. And so it was a really good opportunity for me to kind of get some things out of my head about these works. I could have written about quite a few others. I actually limited it in certain respects to ones that I thought people could easily access and kind of verify it. I mean, but there were so many other Grove authors that I know of and that I've read and considered that I could have drawn into it and would like to someday, because I do think it is a fairly consistent sort of formal aspect of what they were doing at the time. But yeah, that was and that was the motivation. There was a kind of, it was something that was sort of waiting to be written, and the opportunity arose, and that's the contribution. So
Can you talk a little bit more, or give an example of what cinematic writing is? How you identified that?
Yeah, that's what I really try to, I kind of hedge it a little bit up front, almost in the sense of, like, it's really very difficult to actually to pin down what cinematic writing in certain respects would be, but I do link it to, and I think all of these authors in their own way, they either explicitly or in the context of how they formally express through the word or through silences and lack of words in these novels, there's a kind of machinic quality to it. So there's certain machines whether it's Burroughs's word machines or the way in which machines, they don't come so directly into film except the camera itself, but there is a kind of mechanistic quality to it. There's a particular way in which you start to have certain elements. I hesitate to call them, sort of copying some of the other things that has been said, haptic, but you have, certain characteristics that one would typically associate with cinema, like cuts, like montages, like blocks that start to become, they start to cohere and become graspable and perceptible in the text in a way that I think is quite unusual. It wasn't unheard of before Grove, of course. I actually even talk about Herman Melville. I talk about The Confidence Man as being an utterly out of time and nonsensical novel, because when you read it in retrospect, it only makes sense, and it resembles kind of what I'm calling cinematic writing. But it starts to have these characteristics that sort of seem to cross back and forth, something that you might more associate with Vertov or Eisenstein, particularly around editing techniques and around the formal techniques of it. So it's a little bit different. What I'm not trying to articulate is simply what we might associate with quote unquote cinematic writing in its kind of scope and in the sort of manifest content of the writing, where it's sort of grand and it kind of evokes a sort of kind of epic quality or something of that sort that is sometimes linked. And it's like, oh, it's very grand. It's like an epic cinema. I don't mean it in that sense. I mean it, again, linking it back to what I'm understanding to be the formal elements, which are much more about those structural and the sense that you get, the dissolution of anything like a narrative sort of coherence sometimes, which I think in cinema, whether it's montage or whether it's certain experimentations that we would associate with the image and with the edits and so on. So that's the kind of crossover. I mean, and I would say it's quite loose. It's not a tight definition in that I'm in a somewhat excessive way kind of asserting this, trying to make the reader see and sort of consider it from that point of view. But I don't think it coheres as like, oh yes, it closes the circle as this is a definition of cinematic writing, but this is what I mean. So it's machinic, and also it I guess in a weird sort of way, it's most effective. And I try to make this argument somewhat surprisingly, even for me, in kind of working through this material, I would come to the conclusion that, unlike a lot of the other works that Grove published at the time that were much more explicitly political in their orientation, Franz Fanon or Abby Hoffman, or there's a number of works, Che Guevara's Diaries, like quite famous works that are very explicitly political, revolutionary. But the sort of outcome here is actually quite different. There's a kind of sort of cutting off, a sort of stasis, a sort of grinding to a halt. It seems to sort of eradicate a kind of utopian politics, which is not something you would associate with Grove at all. But if you think about Beckett, certain elements of Duras, certainly it's explicit in Burroughs, right? I mean, rubbing out the word, I mean, how much clearer can you make it? And so that also runs a little bit counter to the kind of, retrospective countercultural read of Grove, particularly given that they were also fighting censorship and doing all sorts of things. But there was an undertone that was very different. The formal sort of innovations actually produce a very different kind of outcome that doesn't easily lend itself to sort of ideological or political sort of framings in the way that it's often ascribed to it. So, and I think that that's actually characteristic to the sort of all over the placeness, if I could put it that, of Barney himself, a very weird, brilliant character that you could not pin down. You couldn't pin down so many of the things. And so what motivates him? What's the criteria? What is he like? And I think that this gives some insight into that as well, which was a bit of a personal dimension, but something that I thought was relevant to, at least to what I was trying to do there. So, so I don't think I fully answered the question because I don't think I can, right? But I'm not sure I would want to either, right? Closing off that it would seem, I don't know if I would say counterproductive, but I like the sort of the fact that it's open enough to argue about,
Mm-hmm.
which is what these works I think do, amongst other things.
Mm,
So
Mm-hmm.
I personally love that answer because I've been, working with sort of the idea of literary cinema and cinematic writing myself for years now, and sometimes I forget that actually maybe the correct answer is that we are not supposed to find an actual definition that,
right.
puts us in a bit of a corner. So, it's in the case of Semben, the Black Girl short story. Actually, let me backtrack a little bit because like that the book that I mentioned before, Cine Poetry by Cristoforo Romano, at the very beginning, he makes this argument about the poetry of Mallarmé, saying it's cinematic. And one of the sort of proofs, right, or in support of that is like, oh, Mallarmé lived right around the corner from a theater. So like he must have like he knew like he was going to the movies all the time, right? Which always seemed kind of flimsy in a sense, but I think maybe the answer is that cinematic images kind of tend to be, sort of overpower us. And now that we, especially with film scholars, when we look at literary text, we might have a very different predisposition to read those texts by way of filmic images. So, and that's what I struggle with. And then where is that fine line? Um, but in the case of Semben, maybe it makes sense because 1962, he writes a collection of short stories, one of which is what's called, translated as Promised Land in English, but it's the story of Diwana, Black Girl, that later becomes La Noire de, which later becomes Black Girl, the film about 4 years later. But at the same time, he's prepping to do Borom Saret, which is his first film in 1963. So Semben is already sort of like living these in between these two worlds as both writer and filmmaker. And the example I give my students that, of cinematic writing is that the first 5 paragraphs of the original short story really kind of function in a similar way to mainstream cinema of placing us in a particular context, starting out with an establishing shot of Antibes in the south of France, then moving to the neighborhood, one whole paragraph about the neighborhood, then to the streets, then to the villa, and then it ends with actually the short story begins with the suicide. So it ends in a close-ups, right? So this is a very sort of like established practice of entering a particular visual narrative that Zemben kind of co-opts and but I never saw in any of his writings any reference to like, I was thinking cinematically about this, which goes back to Richard's answer. Like, it's really hard to sort of like, kind of clearly define cinematic writing, and intent and all that. But that is a very good example, as far as I'm concerned, of how, and another reason why I wanted to write this chapter is, sort of this transition from literary works to cinematic works and sort of like the trace that it, that carries to Borom Sara, to Black Girl, and then later to Hala.
I went back even a little bit further and sort of, you know, I start out almost in an absurd way in the chapter that I contributed, in that I'm citing a 19th century novel and saying that, when we read it back in retrospect, right? So if film can exist as world literature, then actually it could pre-exist cinema itself. So the cinematic logics, the techniques, we retroactively kind of read it, or it happens again almost in a kind of quasi, I don't know, it almost follows an arc of afterwardness, which is almost traumatic in a certain way. But it it seems to me that the technology of cinema only kind of, it brings together things that were already in existence in certain ways, right? If that's possible, then of course film as world literature starts to make a lot of sense, because it travels and it has, even before the technology that enables what we now call cinema in specific terms, some of these things were still around. It needed a catalyst. It needed something to bring it together, and we're consistently, kind of rereading it, as it were, re-seeing it, and it changes, right? So nothing is safe and nothing is closed. So cinematic, so I I basically said Melville is writing cinema. And I think in formal
Right. This
terms,
is
that's ridiculous.
Eisenstein. Eisenstein wrote that famous essay about Dickens, saying
Yeah,
that it was,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly. And I would completely agree with that. Like you just don't know. But it also, I think, is really quite pertinent to in its own way what all of us sitting here, and the other contributors who perhaps were not able to be with us, but that possibility actually makes the volume possible in a certain sense. At least it did for me, which is like to
Mm.
explore this counterintuitive way in which we're traversing time, that this historical arc is not quite so clear. The technological sort of interventions are not quite so clear, and that's the exciting and creative part of this. The sort of critical element of it then becomes something a bit different. And so yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. And I really like that, Vlad, in your chapter, right? When because you describe that cinematicness,
Yeah.
and you don't have to say it. You don't have to do that. And it exists all over the place. Once you start looking for it and rereading, you kind of retrospectively reading. I mean, I read classic ethnographic texts, and I realize that they're deploying a certain modality of cinema. I mean, Molinovsky, the founder of British social anthropology. I mean, read the introduction to Argonauts from the Western Pacific. That is cinematic writing. Imagine yourself on a beach. Imagine yourself alone. And of course, it's a classic European trope of the white man alone with the natives, and you've got problematic stuff in there. But it's cinematic with establishing shots, with close-ups, with the epic sort of widescreen kind of elements at certain points, and it's brilliant. And there's no possible way that it would have been associated with cinema except in retrospect.
Mm.
Um,
So I thought that Toby was going to join us for a minute, but I do want to comment on this chapter a little bit. He wrote on James Bond, and he wrote on the figure of the international snob. And in the middle of his writing on that, which is delightful, Amazon bought the rights to James Bond, which was very controversial because James Bond is considered quintessentially British, and then suddenly the global or the American kind of steps in and decides that it's going to create the future of James Bond. So he was very funny on that whole purchase of that franchise at that time. So you guys were kind of hinting that you had questions for each other, particularly around the haptic. And I also think around the idea of the fiction nonfiction, which I want to call the ethnographic, which seems to be a theme that was circulating in everybody's. So does anyone have a question they want to ask someone else? I know I've been asking the follow-ups, but do you have follow-ups for each other?
I mean, I listening to everybody talking. I mean, and by the way, this question doesn't maybe directly have to do with either of the questions that you raised, Robin. But when I was listening to everyone talking, I was thinking about how I mean, at least the people here have really been talking about like formal aesthetic, formal innovation in some way. And then there were also references. I think everybody referred to Rancière, if I'm not mistaken. But one thing that didn't come up from Rancière is this sort of connected to formal innovation, perhaps, is like the redistribution of the sensible, like how these formal innovation, I mean, are they actually enabling a kind of redistribution of the sensible in the way that Rancière talks about it, which then would connect to, okay, what is political art? Because if political art is art that, actually achieves that kind of redistribution, then, I mean, and I don't really have maybe a whole, articulated question, but it's just maybe I see this shared thread, and maybe people might want to comment on that. I mean, like Zahi was talking about, like how comedy, right, is not something that's associated with a genre that's associated with issues around a Palestine or Palestinian identity, right? Like, yeah, anyways.
Yeah, maybe I can speak a little bit to that. I mean, I think you can see the resistance to any kind of attempt to redistribute this sensible, right? How the world gets divided. And, everybody kind of appreciates Solomon's innovations, right? His art. But, when there's a scene which is a kind of revenge fantasy, you have a kind of Palestinian ninja taking on the Israeli soldiers. And people are like, oh, this is too violent, right? Too one-sided. So this language of nonviolence becomes fetishized and functions precisely to preserve a status quo, which has been stifling for Palestinians. So, part of my chapter deals a lot with the reception of the film, and how people, want to separate the political from the aesthetic. They can appreciate the aesthetic, but the political too skewed, makes folks uncomfortable. And retroactively, with the Gaza war happening, the genocide happening, rewatching the film, talking about the film gives you a different flavor because there's a kind of narrative in the world. You begin with Palestinian violence, and then the Israelis are just reacting to that violence. So the film is trying to get into what is the normal condition of Palestinians? It's a condition of violence. And I think that the film does that very well. I think it gestures through this redistribution of the sensible, but we can notice the mechanism that blocks it in discourse, authority, and the charge of one of the critics horribly blames Palestinian violence for producing Ariel Sharon and now Netanyahu. It's like you blaming the victim for the reality that is constantly increasing on Palestinians. So the role of art, film, refusing the colonizer's language, refusing the colonizer's narrative of what is violence, what is nonviolence. And there is this kind of logic of, what the liberal world wants from Palestinians is a kind of decaffeinated Palestinian. And the film gives you a hyper caffeinated Palestinian in certain moments.
Does anyone else have a response to the rentier and the distribution of the sensible? Your piece, Evren, is all about that, right? Because you're
I mean, it didn't occur to me until after, by the way, that was, I mean, in the next thing that I was writing, it's, which is on an experimental documentary about the US-Mexico border. There, I get into, I started thinking around, the redistribution of the sensible, and only in working on that piece, then I thought, oh, when I was writing Border, I must have been also thinking about that, even though I never mention it in the chapter. But yeah, I mean, something that I haven't mentioned, and I think in the chapter I did this in a kind of evocative way and not really. I mean, there is some. I do elaborate on this concept of the haptic phallus, but when I invented the term, I was like, okay, it's evocative. I'm not quite sure how this yet works, but let me just see how this goes here. But now I'm thinking maybe that's also like is there a way to think about the phallus as haptic? And is this like, can a film do that? Is Border able to do that? And then of course, the senses, like the prioritization of I mean, is it really is the film allowing us to see things that were invisible to us before, hear things that, we weren't able to hear before? And I mean, I don't have answers like to those kinds of questions right now, but I think there's something in the film, yes, it is at least attempting to do that and like completely and radically different from the story, because the story at the end, I mean, it's so quite disappointing because it really falls back to this sort of sort of repairing the sort of the heteronormative Oedipal, triangle. Like, okay, even though they're trolls, they have a baby, and then there are two characters in the film that are both trolls, and they do have a baby in the film too. But the film really is against the reconciliation of the couple, and really becomes about, the Tina sort of taking care of the baby on her own, and raising the baby as a troll child, kind of. Um, but anyways,
Did you find similarly to Zahi, did you find that the distribution or the redistribution of the Sensible was closed down in any way by the critics?
Yeah, I mean, they're attempting to close it down, but I think
Yeah,
that, watching the film breaks through. I mean, it exposes the ideology, right, behind what sustains, what reproduces the status quo. I mean, this is the work of ideology. So the work of the critic here is the work of doing the labor of ideology, of reproducing reality. Whereas the film, through kind of Rancière's lenses, is a disruption of the status quo.
Did you
So
see
we can
something
look at the
similar?
critics critically and watch the film and see how the film exposes the biases, right? The investments of the critic in a certain reality, a certain image of Palestinians that can be tolerated, but kept at a distance.
Mhm. Okay, well, we've been going on for an hour, and I feel like I should say something conclusive, but I have nothing to say except that I was really glad to meet you all, and this was a great conversation. So thank you mostly for your chapters that were so excellent in the book, and also for coming here today to talk about them. So thank you,
Thank
and
you,
I hope
Robin.
that we'll
thank
all
you.
have connections or ways of
The
working
opportunity.
together
Thank
again
you.
in the future.
Sounds
So,
great.
bye.
Wonderful to meet you
Oh,
all.
Bye.
nice
Great
Thanks
to
meeting
very
you
meet
all.
much.
you. Bye.
Weekend. Bye.